Hello and welcome to another webinar presented by HTAi. Today's presentation is HTA in Childhood Diseases. This webinar will be exploring this topic, as well as engaging the audience on their interest in a possible new HTAi Interest Group focused on. During the webinar, some polling features will be used. You can access these through a link that will be posted in the chat. Additionally, you can use this link to submit any questions you may have during the presentation. If you are joining us in the Zoom call, we ask you leave your mic muted and camera off until our speakers open up to a group conversation. I will now hand over to our host. We hope you to enjoy today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Bryce, for that introduction. I am presuming that people in the waiting room in the Zoom room will now be let in, and we hope that we have many of you watching on YouTube. Welcome. So if we go to the next slide, we are indeed today talking about HTA in childhood diseases, with the idea of whether we should be setting up an interest group within the multidisciplinary society, which is HTAi. So if we go to the next slide, we know that some of you watching may not be familiar with HTA. You may come from different backgrounds. So we thought we'd give you just a slight introduction into what we mean by this strange term of health technology assessment. Well, luckily, a couple of years ago, all the international groups working in HTA agreed on one definition. And that definition is that HTA is a multidisciplinary process that uses explicit methods to determine the value of using a health technology at different points in the life cycle. And it's used for decision making. And often that's about pricing and reimbursement decisions, which means it indicates whether patients have access to technologies or not. And in this setting, technologies can cover anything from vaccinations to prevention, to medicines, devices, diagnostics, and indeed rehabilitation. If we move on to the next slide, a key element of health technology assessment is the determination of the value of a health technology. And that must be undertaken in a wide variety of ways. This should include dimensions of clinical effectiveness and safety. And every HTA body around the world considers this aspect, particularly of relative effectiveness compared to the best standard of care. Some agencies look at other elements as well, such as costs and economic implications, particularly the so-called value for money of a new intervention, but not all agencies do that. Some agencies look at ethical, social, cultural, and legal aspects. Some look at organizational and environmental aspects, and others look at wider implications in determining value, taking into account the perspectives of patients, relatives, and caregivers and citizens. So if we move on to the next slide with that kind of understanding of what HTA is, let's think about this society of HTAi. Its purpose is to promote and develop the use of HTA to systematize decision-making about technologies and make it transparent. And it hosts a range of interest groups, and these are professional and scientific forums for all those who undertake, use, and have an interest in HTA. And these interest groups form a network to exchange information and collaborate on projects of mutual interest. They can share information, but most importantly, they can develop new research materials and ideas. And a number of the interest groups, like those for patient and citizen involvement, for ethical aspects, for medical devices, for hospital-based HTA that already exist in HTAi, have developed materials which are used internationally. So let's go on to our next slide. And it outlines why I had a thought, which was, do we need an interest group that is looking at HTA in childhood diseases? And this thought came to me as I was in the middle of a 3-year research project funded by the European Commission called Impact HTA, where we were looking at appraisal process for rare disease treatments. And within this, I identified that there were many issues related to childhood diseases, because we know that according to the European definition, there are over over 6,000 rare diseases, and about 70% of them have an onset purely in children. So there are many childhood onset rare diseases. But what I found looking at what agencies do in relation to rare diseases, none of them mention explicitly issues relating to childhood diseases. And if we go to the next click, we can see here that the issues we saw arising were issues relating to what outcomes we should be studying, what are suitable measurements in children. And by children, we may be thinking about babies, we may be thinking about toddlers, young children, and as adolescents. But there are also important ethical debates to be considered when we think about what is value and what is value for money in a childhood disease, which may be severely life-limiting. And also, in particular for childhood diseases, the caregiver burden can be incredibly substantial. So these were the issues I was coming across, which just didn't seem to be discussed in any HTA body. And if we go to the next slide, I started having conversations with a range of people about, is it just me? Are these issues common? Do other people think about these issues? And I found a range of people that had already thought deeply about the issues related to HTA and childhood diseases. So I'm delighted to have a panel now to present their reflections on this issue. So we have Dr. Avi Denberg, who is an oncologist, a pediatric oncologist in the Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto in Canada. We have Fleur Chandler, who's head of market access at Sanofi, but she wears two hats because she's also a caregiver for a child with Duchenne and chair of Project Hercules, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative. We have Wendy Ungar, who's chair in economic evaluation and technology assessment, again at the Sick Kids here in Canada. And we have Brent Fraser, who is Vice President of Pharmaceutical Reviews at CADETH. So the first three will be giving presentations and Brent will be reflecting from an HTA body's perspective. We'll have a panel debate with them about the issues that are relevant to childhood diseases and a bit of debate about whether this is a rare disease issue or whether it relates to more prevalent diseases as well. And then there will be time halfway through the webinar to actually engage with us. And if we just go back to the previous slide just for a moment. Actually, we'll go on to the next slide. Sorry, I'm getting my slides confused. That's it. What we will be doing in the general discussion is thinking about what an interest group should be, what scope should it have, what are the most important topics it should cover, and how we should avoid duplication, making sure that we don't do what another initiative is undertaking. And if you'd like to join in that debate live, you can join us on the Zoom call, and you can see the meeting ID there, which is 970-566-24835. So jot that down and join us on the Zoom call, because if you're on the YouTube, you'll only be able to interact via Slido. And we will be coming at the end of the call, if I go on to the next click, to ask for volunteers. So bear that in mind as well. So let's now go on to the first presentation, and I'm going to invite Avi to take over the presentation. Thank you, Avi.
Thanks so much, Karen. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be here, to be part of this panel of illustrious co-panelists. Thank you so much for arranging this and inviting us into HTAi as well. This is an issue that I think everyone on the panel has thought deeply about. And so I hope by the end of this, we convince you that there are indeed unique sociobiological, clinical, evidentiary, and social values considerations that attend uniquely to children and that would warrant some concerted focus by HTAi. I don't know if I should start in typical Canadian fashion by apologizing for the preponderance of Canadians on this panel, but this is definitely internationally relevant. So we hope you share that feeling. Next slide, please. So my title there spoke to evidentiary considerations in pediatrics, and I kept that explicitly broad because I was asked to speak to the clinical parameters or clinical considerations in respect of HTA for children. But I really do think that so many of the issues that we're going to speak to over the course of this panel, whether it be Fleur and the patient perspective, Wendy economic perspective, and Brent from the perspective of an HTA organization, so many of those issues bleed into one another, cross boundaries, and are difficult to disentangle. And that's part of, I think, the complexity of HTA generally and of HTA in children in particular. And I'm hoping that we can seek to disentangle some of those and have good debate on them. I wanted to start this brief talk by framing this in the context of precision medicine, which is a broader, I think, paradigmatic shift in the way that medicine is practiced and studied, and in the way that technologies are developed, that provides a bit of a foundation for some of the unique considerations in children. So many of you will know that increasing scientific innovation in understanding the genetic and genomic causes of diseases has really revolutionized both how we characterize diseases and understand how to put them in different buckets, but also stimulated novel research and technology development in terms of how we treat them. And I think that's really challenged HTA in terms of thinking about how to understand evidence, how to generate evidence, and to understand what truly is value and for whom. And this sort of collides with or concatenates with a broader recognition in HTA over the past decade or so of the need to have broader perspectival representation of what value means across industry, patients, payers, clinical providers, ethicists, researchers, and so forth. Next slide, please. So there really has been already a lot of deep thought on this, and many on the webinar will be familiar with efforts to try to elaborate value frameworks that attend to precision medicine. I've just listed a couple of examples here from work done at ISPOR and in journals such as Value in Health that try to really isolate what are the differences that a precision medicine paradigm brings to bear on HTA in terms of understanding the value of diagnostic tests and how they align with treatments, or understanding new uncertainties that arise as a result of this new mode of precision medicine. So there's definitely elegant work going on in this space. But I would argue that there is still a tremendous amount of uncertainty and increasing uncertainty that is a result of this revolution in medicine. Next slide, please. And one more click. That HTA bodies are grappling with and are trying to respond to. And I think that there are some really elegant examples internationally of the way that HTA bodies are doing this. And I've just put up 3 quick snapshots of this from a few different, I would say, really leading HTA bodies or consortia internationally. CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and EU Net HTA, all of which have, I would say, striven to adapt their frameworks for how we do HTA and how we consider value in response to these evidentiary challenges brought both by precision medicine and also by a recognition of a need to consider some broader inputs than just clinical benefit or perhaps value for money. Next slide, please. So I think what I really want to hit home today, and what I imagine Fleur and Wendy and Brent will also speak to, is the layering on top of additional uncertainties that pediatrics brings to bear. And these revolve both at the level of the broader health system as well as specific to HTA itself. And I'll speak to some of these. So in respect of the health system generally, the political economy or market dynamics of the way that medicines are researched, developed, and regulated really has quite a significant bearing on access to drugs for children in a variety of health system contexts. The downstream of that, the indications that are given, the nature of the evidence on both safety and efficacy or effectiveness really impact upon whether or not drugs come to market and get approved for sale in countries. Which drugs actually make it to HTA bodies for review is something that I think bears scrutiny in respect of pediatric drugs and indications, because many of these are initiated by manufacturers and related to some of the market dynamic aspects above, and that I'll speak to a bit more, this tends to under-prioritize children. And then there are political environments, obviously, for payers in terms of how they adjudicate which drugs to fund, based both on HTA recommendations and broader political considerations. I think what we'll dig into in a lot of the rest of the session today is really some of the HTA specific challenges, both around the generation of evidence, around economic evidence, and perhaps around some of the ethical dimensions of access. Next slide, please. So I was asked to speak in particular to challenges in the generation of pediatric clinical evidence. I am a physician, I treat children with cancer, and so I see day in and day out children with challenging diagnoses and who have need of access to oftentimes novel and expensive therapies to treat their diseases, and not infrequently run up against barriers in terms of accessing those technologies. And this is obviously of huge strain and anxiety for patients and families, and also for clinicians. And so one of the perspectives I hope to represent today really was that clinical one. And I think some of these challenges stem from some of the things I've hinted at in my prior slides. So firstly, in large part because of this precision medicine revolution, the way that we characterize and categorize diseases is changing, and this has real implications for drug indications. The nature of pediatric clinical trials has some inherent challenges to it or to them in terms of their design, the ability to actually recruit patients or participants for research, and the statistical methods that we use to analyze outcomes from such trials. As I hinted at, there are some broader pharmaceutical market dynamics that impact upon the development of pediatric medicines and how we regulate them. And then finally, there's some life course effects that need to be uniquely considered in pediatrics, given the timing of onset of many of these diseases. Next slide, please. So I've tried to hint in this pathway here, this attempt at something of a pharmaceutical value chain. What are some of the barriers in access to medicines for children, particularly innovative ones? And I would argue that it's, I think, a fair and broadly applicable statement that few innovative therapies for children and youth are being developed and approved for sale and funding consideration in most developed health systems. And I want to harken back to Karen's comment about rarity. Some of this relates to rarity, but not all of it. And I want to speak to what I like to call the ubiquity of rarity in pediatrics. So as Karen noted, about 70 or 75% of rare diseases start and occur almost exclusively in childhood. And in fact, despite the fact that they're rare, in combination, they're not so rare. So about 1 in 15 children develops a rare disease. So partly this is about challenges in research and generating robust evidence of a treatment's effectiveness and safety because of the rarity of the condition. This also relates to research ethic challenges, both in terms of how research ethics are conducted by research ethics boards and the need to coordinate those better for pediatric trials, but also to the acceptability of trials to patients and to families and to providers in terms of really sensitive discussions with pediatric patients and I'd say historical reticence to involve children in clinical trials. That's thankfully changing. As I've alluded to, there are few trials in part because when many of these products are developed by industry, there aren't the strongest market incentives to do so because of the rarity of disease or the challenges with doing some of these trials. And there's often limited earmarked public funding for such trials in pediatrics. I've mentioned the sort of concatenation or the overlapping of challenges in both precision medicine and pediatrics, and these are compounding these evidentiary challenges. And this combination of a limitation in incentives for industry and some weak obligations on the part of some regulators to both incent and compel the submission of drugs for pediatric HTA evaluation leads to few pediatric indications, limited formulary listings, and a lot of off-label prescribing for kids, which is pretty well the norm. Next slide, please. So I alluded to precision therapies, and again, this is precision therapies in pediatrics, so we're talking now the rare of the rare. Again, precision medicine is treatment targeted to fight or fix an underlying, often genetic cause of disease. these treatments oftentimes represent either the only or really promising new avenues of therapy for complex and rare diseases in pediatrics, and they're often very expensive, so have outsized impact on healthcare budgets. And I've just put up one example of a fairly revolutionary therapy in TRK fusion positive cancers, which has real relevance to a number of pediatric cancers. But as you can see from this waterfall plot here, is applicable across a range of both adult and pediatric cancers. And HTA agencies that have been challenged to assess this technology for public funding have really run up against what to do in the context of a histology agnostic indication, meaning we're not talking about the specific type of cancer anymore in terms of where it happens, but we're really talking about a treatment that targets the genomic change underlying cancer's development, and how to make sense of the benefit of this therapy from things as broadly applicable but different as colon cancers and infantile fibrosarcoma in children. So that the nature of the evidence is really challenging at a clinical level for HTA organizations to deal with. Next slide, please. So this is a very busy slide, and I apologize for that, but I wanted to at least give a broad sense of some of the thinking that's going into how to innovate in pediatric trial design and in trial design more broadly to adapt to this emerging uncertainty. And this is nice work done by the Canadian Council of Academies about 8 years or so ago. And really what these flow diagrams demonstrate is at a high level, I think, the need to ask some really challenging and pointed questions about what information is out there, what information needs to be generated, and what information both clinicians and regulators and HTA bodies need to be able to be comfortable with in terms of ascribing clinical benefits to a medicine and being comfortable that a medicine can move forward for sale in a country and ultimately funding. And the panel on the right alludes to some flexibilities that might need to be built into trial designs in order to accommodate this uncertainty and some of the dynamics in children. And that could include things like adaptive or sequential designs to trials, the consideration of whether or not to use placebo controls or active comparators, thinking about things like N of 1 trials or working across networks or multiple centers to generate larger recruitment volumes, and a variety of other things.
1 minute, Avi.
Yeah, one further click, please. And I wanted to speak quickly to some emerging trial designs relevant in adults, but of particular relevance in children that are seeking to do this. I'll go maybe to the next slide quickly, just given time, to give you a sort of real lived example of how this is playing out. So this is a snapshot of an approach to trial designs, courtesy of colleagues that are part of a precision oncology network for children in Canada called Profile. And really what this attempts to show you is the array of types of innovative approaches to trials and therapy that need to be considered if we're to get access to different innovative therapies for children with a variety of cancers. And this encompasses things like basket trials, which much like that larotrectinib example I showed you, take a whole range of cancers with the same underlying change and apply the same treatment to them and see what happens. To things like umbrella trials, these capture cohorts here that take a variety of, platform trials that take a variety of different cancers and look at different drugs and drop some arms and add some arms, as well as things like N of 1 trials. All of which to say there's a need for real innovation in how we think about trial design and actually how we think about outcomes. Next slide, please. I think there's also need for and room for regulatory reform to do a better job of dealing with this uncertainty and both incentivizing, that's the carrot, and compelling, that's the stick, regulators to do a better job of this. And I just picked out two, I think, really robust examples of how some stringent regulatory authorities in both the United States and the FDA and in Europe and the EMA are seeking to innovate in the regulatory space through legislation that both incentivizes and compels pharmaceutical manufacturers to generate pediatric clinical trials data. And we don't have time to get into this too much now, but I'm happy to speak to this a bit more in our discussion. Next slide, please. And so lastly, very quickly, I think we can't forget life course impacts of therapies. This is just a quick snapshot of some results from the the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study, which looked at the implications of cancer therapy on kids across the life course. And really what you're seeing here in these numbers is a huge outsized relative risk for a number of very serious health conditions in survivors of childhood cancer as compared with their siblings. So we know that these therapies have implications for children as they grow into adulthood. These are often deleterious, and these impact kids across the life course. And we need to factor that into HTA. Next slide, please. This is, I think, my last slide, and I just wanted to end with, because I think it goes into Fleur's talk really nicely, a little bit more of the patient perspective and the need to widen the value lens. So as I mentioned, we need to think more creatively and more flexibly about outcome measures. And I think absolutely critical to that is thinking about patient-reported outcomes and what patients and families value. I think we also need to consider what payers and what the general public thinks are criteria of value that should be brought to bear to pediatric HTA. And we have an increasing opportunity to do that with a variety of the innovative research that's happening internationally in this space. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll close and I'll thank all my collaborators, SickKids and internationally, and say I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest, and I'll pass the baton to Fleur. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Avi. Over to you, Fleur.
Thank you, Avi. And for the next slide, please. Thank you. I'm delighted to join you today, and I'm really pleased to be in such illustrious company. As Avi said, I'm going to bring the industry and patient perspective. As Karen mentioned earlier, I do have several hats. My first hat is that one from an industry perspective. I'm a health economist and HTA specialist with about 30 years experience in industry and clinical trials, health technology assessment, health economics at a global, regional and local level across several companies. I'm also a parent. I've been a parent for 18 years. I have 2 children, and I've been a parent to a child with a rare condition for 13 years, as my son Dominic was diagnosed when he was 3. Some of those years were also spent in a clinical trial. So I have another hat, which is actually being a clinical trial participant. So 2 years of our lives were spent in a clinical trial. And I also have the hat of being part of the patient organisations. I'm on the advisory board of Duchenne UK. So with that in mind, I will have some hats on, one or all of them during this presentation. So for the next slide, please, if I may. I'll very quickly recap on this, because this is Karen illustrated this beautifully earlier on, but essentially we do know why we need to evaluate new health technologies, and this is what a payer is looking for. So from an industry perspective, we have to understand that this is what we need to provide to enable the payers to assess a new health technology. And this isn't just in children, but this is in everything. So is the intervention needed? Can we identify the patients? Is it safe? Does it work? How well does it work? How meaningful is it to the patient and the family? Is it worth it? Can we control its use, and can we afford it? So those are the sort of tenets of the health technology assessment. And if we go to the next slide, please, Ivani. This is what it typically looks like. So from an industry perspective, what we would be doing at sort of starting at phase 2 is looking to answer all of those questions, and it turns into an evidence package that looks a little bit like this. So I have systematic literature reviews which cover like the what's going on in that area and trying to identify what the issues are. You have evidence synthesis, where you're pulling not just clinical trials together, but any real world evidence and all sorts of different things to make sure you've got a good evidence package. You're trying to denote the natural history of the disease, so you can see what a difference your intervention might make. You need to make sure you've got the right patient-reported outcomes in there, that they're actually relevant to the disease and to the patient, and that they can show a meaningful difference. Quality of life is key in the cost effectiveness markets, as the decision is made on a quality of length of life equation. That's all pulled together with an economic model, so a cost effectiveness model, and we need to understand the burden of illness so that we can build up the costs in the cost side of that model. All of this will cost per indication per asset, probably about £1 million. So it's not an insignificant investment in the HTA evidence generation piece. And what you're trying to do is articulate what's happening to the patient in a language that a payer might understand. And in a common adult disease, this is relatively straightforward. You can use the clinical trials, you can translate the data that's coming from that, and you can articulate what the costs are. In a paediatric disease, it is more challenging, and we'll come on to some of those challenges in a minute. And then in rare paediatric diseases, it's more challenging still. So we go to the next slide. I'm going to take my industry hat off, all the other hats off, and have my patient hat on firmly here. Patient resources are very scarce and they are really precious, and particularly in children and particularly in rare diseases. The time that is taken up by being a parent of a child with an illness is enormous, and you don't really have the time to fill in lots of questionnaires and attend visits and all of those things because you have so much going on. That also links into your energy levels. It's really difficult to keep your energy levels high and engage in research when you've got all this other stuff going on in the background. But you do know that you are a source of data and you are a source of knowledge. You probably know, sorry Avi, you probably know quite a bit more than the clinician in many cases as a parent. And you also have this hope that we really can't play fast and loose with patients and parents' hope, because if there is a trial that may actually generate some cure or in treatment, then that's something that you can't give false hope. And that means that patients have trust in industry and in clinicians, and all of this is bundled up in a huge amount of resilience in parents of children who are sick. So please bear this in mind as you're sort of moving forward with the evidence generation piece. Kev, the next slide, please. So Wendy will cover far more of this in far more detail, but I just wanted to sort of have a little sort of think about the challenges that you do see in childhood disease. And I think there is a scale. Somebody asked in one of the, I think it was a question when we were promoting the webinar about why aren't we focusing on rare diseases? And I think there was just a scale in terms of the challenges of evidence. So in all paediatric diseases, I think you're struggling with finding the right PRO and quality of life instruments. You have the direct influence of a carer as a proxy, and also that carer influence on patient performance. If you're asking a patient, a young child, to complete a task, there's a huge influence of the parent in that space. You need to understand the meaningful clinical endpoints, and I think there's often a lack of understanding of the impact of the disease in children, and I think that goes across the board in paediatric evidence generation. If you sort of start morphing into the progressive diseases where the child is getting progressively more sick, you have the underlying impact of the growth of the child with the deterioration from the disease at the same time. So you've got a moving baseline, which is very hard to articulate and capture. And then for those patients who sort of move into adulthood, the care setting changes, so the costs all change in terms of where the care is being delivered. You have the disability paradox, where people with a disability and children with disabilities may not see themselves as particularly disadvantaged, which is, great, but it doesn't help in terms of trying to articulate what the impact of the disease is. And progression markers are often unidentified or unmapped. As you get into the rare space, you've got very small heterogeneous populations who are overstretched. Registries are very sparse and data is hard to access. And then as you get into the sort of the fatal stage or the really progressive diseases, time is absolutely critical. And then you have these exhausted patient and carer groups who cannot keep giving into clinical trials. So all of that means that it's actually quite high risk for an industry hat back on. It's quite high risk to go and try to find this evidence. And the sort of limited funding and understanding of the need for specific investment in HTA evidence, because we're looking very much at the clinical side of things rather than the economic side of things. Go to the next slide, please. So just briefly, this Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a rare disease. It is pediatric onset. It is life-limiting. It is progressive, and it is fatal. children, such as my son, will have no protein dystrophin, and diagnosed in childhood, nearly always boys. And children will become progressively more disabled, be paralysed by their teens, and don't usually live beyond their 20s. There's an estimated 30,000 patients worldwide. There's currently no cure, but there's quite a few things in development. Symptomatic treatment only, which is steroids, cardiac management, respiratory management, endocrine management, bone health, physical therapy, orthotics, surgery in some cases. But there is a pipeline of therapies coming through, which gives hope to the later generations. So if I go to the next slide, please. So I think you might be sort of wondering, like, how am I going to put all these hats back on again? And essentially, what I realised was that within a rare disease such as Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it's not possible for one company to create a whole evidence base that's required to get it through a health technology assessment. So, and also, we weren't really hearing that the patient voice was really being articulated by industry. So what we created from a patient organisation perspective was something called Project Hercules. And what Project Hercules is a global collaboration of industry. I think there's 10 pharmaceutical companies involved, clinicians, most importantly, and academics and payers, and most importantly, patient organisations. And what we're doing is creating a evidence base suitable for health technology assessment in Duchenne that can be used by all of the companies, regardless of the mechanism of action of their drug, and therefore providing a gold standard evidence base for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. If you go to the next slide. This is my last slide, so Karen, you don't have to give me a nudge. So this is what it looks like. So I think you remember on the first slide that we had, we talked about what sort of evidence you might need for an HTA in a childhood disease. And what Project Hercules has done is flip that round a little bit, and it's not generated by industry, but it's being led by a patient organisation. And what we've done is created that evidence base. So we've pulled data from across the globe, because it's a rare condition. You can't focus on one country. You have to go global. We've identified disease states, created a natural history model, did a massive review of quality of life metrics used in Duchenne, and came to the conclusion that they weren't adequate. So created a new quality of life metric, which will be a preference measure. It's in that process now. We looked at burden of illness and what's really impacting on the patients. We've created a economic model which all of the companies can use, because it can be you can use cost utility, cost effectiveness, cost minimization, any of those types. We've gone for HTA advice, so we've been to EU Netta and NICE, and we've done the systematic literature reviews and evidence synthesis. So we've basically done all the heavy lifting, but from a central perspective, which means that we now have an evidence base for Duchenne muscular dystrophy and HTA. So it's been taken 4 years to get to this point, which is staggeringly fast, and probably faster than an individual company would have been able to do it. And it's only happened because we've had the interest of pharma companies, we've had interest from academia, and we've had the support of the HTA agencies as well in the activity. So, well, why has it been successful? I mean, the advantages of this process are things like funding, it's spread the cost and the risk across the companies. It's easier to access the data if you come at it from a patient perspective. It's standardized and gold standard. So all of the companies that we use to do this, sorry, my phone's ringing. All of the companies we used to do this, or the academic groups, are sort of world leading in what they do. We've discovered new areas for research, so we're looking now at carer quality of life, and that will probably go across other diseases similar to Duchenne, not just specific to Duchenne, and looking at the burden on patients and families from a social perspective. So it's just a different way of going about things. I hope it's helpful for you to understand it, and I'm always open to have questions about it. And then I'm going to stop there and hand over to Wendy.
Thanks so much, Flo. We're going to take those slides down and let Wendy share her screen. And I think you brought your hats together there to show the value of collaboration. And perhaps that's a model we can think about in the interest group, the multidisciplinary, cross-company, and creating efficiency. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks so much. So as a real-time example of the range of values and preferences, I've decided to show my own slides and advance my own slides. So thanks very much. I'm going to focus very much on the narrow methodological challenges in conducting cost-effectiveness analysis. Of course, all of them apply to rare diseases, but one might consider what these issues are and then magnify them manyfold in the sphere of rare diseases. So of course, understanding as a primary principle the differences between child and adult health in terms of developmental vulnerability, dependency relationships between children and adult caregivers, a child's unique patterns of morbidity and mortality, and of course, their unique patterns of healthcare resource. It's already been said that children are not a single homogeneous group. They really consist of many different age groups. And currently, the guidelines that we have now across the globe, and this is just a very short list, for conducting economic evaluation are quite silent on these challenges when it comes to performing economic evaluation in children. So perhaps not explicitly focused on adults, but they really don't address our unique challenges. I'd say the most progressive guideline is possibly the Washington panel, the US-based guideline that in their 2016 update did consider some of the spillover effects, caregiving effects, and additional payer perspectives that would be relevant when conducting economic evaluation in children. So one can understand that there are complex and changing relationships between a child and all of the adults around them. And this very much will influence how a child can access and use healthcare services. They're dependent on these gatekeepers. Children are not their own agents in terms of accessing and consuming care. So their ability to access care will naturally have an important influence on their outcomes, on their response to treatment. And it goes without saying, or perhaps it should be said, that a child's illness will directly affect the health and well-being of everyone around them, all of their family members, siblings, parents, and other individuals. So when one considers that, you really can't ignore that aspect. That necessitates a family-level approach to measuring health costs and health consequences when doing an economic evaluation. When it comes to child health, there really are multiple settings for delivering care, for delivering services, not just physicians' offices and clinics and hospitals, but in fact, interventions are delivered in schools, at home, in the community, particularly around educational behavioral interventions. And what that means is that, in fact, the healthcare sector is not the only sector funding services and interventions aimed at improving child health. For interventions aimed at improving behavioral conditions, things like autism or learning disabilities like ADHD, you see services that are funded, financed by ministries of education, by community services, social services, child and youth services. All these other sectors are involved in considering interventions and trying to provide them to children and families. Of course, access to and use of services is also going to be influenced by the family configuration, geography, socioeconomic status, all of these demographic factors. And then when one considers the uniqueness of child health, one realizes that when health reforms are introduced or when funding decisions are made or policies are introduced, those policies will have disparate effects on children and on adults. So I want to just quickly go over very high level these specific implications for conducting health economics with regard to defining and selecting health outcomes, performing costing, measurement, excuse me, and analysis. So when we think about what outcomes to measure in an economic evaluation, we need to understand the interwoven nature of child health with the social determinants of health. It's inescapable that we need to consider all of these aspects: child's physical environment, their home, their immediate milieu, the biologic and genetic determinants, of course, and behavioral responses, unique behavioral responses that children will display. And as has been said, children undergo different changes during phases of maturation and development and growth, and all of these are also really important when we think about what are the right outcomes to measure in an economic evaluation. So we might start off with going to some of the more common measures. These are common measures that would be seen in a cost effectiveness analysis where we're measuring health benefit in terms of a natural measure. And these are ones you would see in adult economic evaluations. So things like physical symptoms and disease markers, laboratory markers as intermediate markers, pain, functional status. And then we get into outcomes like duration of life and quality of life. And as we move towards the preference-based measures of quality of life, that enables the calculation of a quality adjusted life year, the recommended approach, very powerful universal metric for comparing benefits across patient groups, across populations in order to make efficient funding recommendations. So yes, we can start off with some of these common measures, but sometimes they're inadequate or they don't exist or they're really non-valid in pediatrics. So then we might want to go to some child-focused measures that might confer more meaning, more insight into how children are responding to new interventions. And that would include things like age group specific quality of life measures. Some of you may be familiar with the PedsQL. This is a licensed generic quality of life instrument that actually has versions for all these different age groups, and the data can be pooled. So it's quite a powerful and valid measure for measuring quality of life in children. Things as simple as days lost from school, school performance, academic achievement, and in some jurisdictions, we actually have population level data on school performance, particularly where there's standardized testing. So, you can be a bit imaginative and think about how we might look at child productivity and child outcomes by using some of these measures. Ability to participate in physical activities, days lost from these activities, and even measures that we administer, global measures to providers and caregivers. So here, just some of the challenges that are quite obvious, capturing the full spectrum of social and physiological impacts. We really need, in addition to administering the outcome measures, to understand that milieu, both in micro and macro environments in which the child resides. It is hard to measure any kind of quality of life or other measure of benefit or outcome in children who are preschoolers, very young children. Very difficult to do, but there are increasingly tools available to us. And again, taking developmental change and maturation into account. We've done this where we've, for chronic diseases over the life course, sampled patients from each stage of development or each age group, understanding that the patterns of resource use and response to treatment will differ for these different age groups. So you can actually construct different models, treat them all like a separate sub-model in order to look at this information and to analyze and synthesize it. With regard to costing, as I've mentioned, health is not the only sector where costs accrue when it comes to child health. Again, in my example of autism, it's diagnosed within the health sector, but all of the costs are really incurred outside of the health sector in terms of delivering early and behavioral interventions, and then over the lifetime, particularly in the adult years, for the most severely affected, providing residential services. So it's absolutely critical that we think outside the box, think outside the healthcare sector to include home, school, community, all these other environments where costs might occur. And of course, it's not just children's resource use that are the key cost item. There are tremendous productivity costs. These are time costs when parents are involved in caregiving for their child that occur, particularly for severe diseases. Parents are going to report missing days from work, or they may report working but at a reduced productivity level. For particularly severe diseases or diagnoses, parents will report, in fact, changing their work status. We can't ignore these caregiver effects when they're happening by taking a narrow healthcare system perspective. These have some social value, understanding what these costs are, and it should inform our policies at a population level. The other thing we tend to ignore, which I think we can do a better job of, is considering future child productivity costs, even for conditions that are not chronic, even for conditions that occur mainly within the child years that may have downstream consequences for a child's ability to, when they're an adult, participate in the workforce and be productive. So we want to be able to take a life course approach as much as we can. This is all kind of a bit of a wish list, because in the end, it really comes down to not only what data do we have available, but are the data valid? And this speaks very much to the kinds of issues that Abby described in trying to conduct clinical trials in children. the results not only may change, they will change as a function of payer perspective. So a societal payer perspective where one considers all costs, regardless of payer, is always recommended in pediatric economic evaluation. I'm glad to say that the US Washington panel guidelines puts the societal payer perspective up front as part of the reference case analysis because of the significant spillover effects and costs that accrue to other sectors. We want to at all times try and achieve adequate long-term time horizons, preferably lifelong time horizons, as I described before. Any kind of economic evaluation is full of uncertainty. I'm not the first to say this today. And especially as you model over longer and longer periods, now you're facing issues like changing prices over time, changing patterns of resource use. So we tend to conduct all of our analyses probabilistically. We consider ranges for parameters as opposed to single values. And we try to incorporate that uncertainty as much as possible into the reference case analysis. We might also consider specific subgroups who may be affected differently or whom we expect to respond differently to treatment to try and isolate some of those uncertain variables. Measurement, talked already quite a bit about the lack of valid and reliable instruments. Although I'm happy to say when it comes to measuring quality of life in children, there are some new valid measures that are coming onto the horizon, and as Fleur mentioned, with the Hercules project as well. So the Health Utilities Index, the HUI, has been around for quite a long time. And now we also have, as a preference-based measure to examine utility for health states, we have the CHU9D, Child Health Utility 9 Dimensions, developed by Catherine Stevens from Sheffield a few years ago, and the Euroqual group that has extended the EQ5D to the EQ5DY. So there are a growing number of measures out there, which is good news. But still, for very young children, what do? We turn to parent proxies. You know, it's okay to use parents as proxy reporters for cost. After all, they're the gatekeepers of their child's care. They know what they're spending. They know what the visits are to the child. However, using a parent proxy for an outcome measure is not a good idea because they really are, it is somewhat subjective. We talked about the spillover effects as well. Finally, in analysis, it's all about building robust decision models and that art of trying to balance uncertainty with the validity of the sources of your data. Things like discounting, looking at cost to multiple individuals are all things that we try to consider when we build our models. So I'm just going to end with this slide on the good news front. This shows you the growth in pediatric economic evaluations over the years since 1980. This is from our PED database, which we maintain at our research group. The red curve indicates the cost effectiveness analysis analytic technique, where the outcome is simply a clinical or health measure of effectiveness. The green curve is cost utility analysis, where we look at qualities. And you can see that there's been quite a steep increase in the number of cost utility analyses over the years. Now it's really taken over as the most common measure. So the news is good. I'm happy to expound further during the panel and during the discussion. Thank you.
Wendy, thank you so much for finishing that trio of presentations there, which took us through from clinical research through to how industry looks at this in terms of market access, and then in terms of the details of economic evaluation, and making us think broader beyond just the fact, you know, children aren't little adults. They have completely different things we need to consider when we're thinking about value, and that wider societal perspective which you gave us there. So Brent, I'll turn to you now as a senior official in CADA. You know, does CADA think about HTA of childhood diseases in any different way? What are your thoughts on what you've heard?
Thanks, Karen. Absolutely, we do. And I have to say thank you to all the panelists, because you've made my job a lot easier by highlighting all of the concerns that we have identified in the HTA space for pediatrics. In our strategic plan, we've actually called out doing more work in the pediatric sector, because we're seeing that this is becoming more and more of an issue over time, and particularly for cancer therapies, where there is a great need for approving funding for pediatric indications. But what we tend to see, though, is that the sponsors or manufacturers of these products are not submitting to the regulator. And one of the issues that we run into quite frequently is limiting our assessments, and we provide funding recommendations to the public drug plans to the indications that have been approved by Health Canada. And as was mentioned earlier, Canada does not have an economic incentive to create or produce pediatric data with new therapies that are coming forward. I think that might be something that Health Canada is looking at, but I obviously can't speak on their behalf. We often are asked by payers as to whether or not there is any evidence available to extend some of our recommendations to include pediatric populations. And often the indications themselves will say or adults 18 years of age and older. That really limits our ability to then kind of generalize our assessment into the pediatric population. And based on what we've heard today, that actually may not even be appropriate, considering which age group we may be asked to provide some guidance on. And I know that the payers are particularly challenged because you could have an indication for 18 and above, but it's almost inevitable that you're going to have one or two cases where somebody is 17 years of age or 16 years of age. And that then becomes quite a political discussion in Canada, and I would guess in most jurisdictions around, well, why can't you just extend it down to 16? And I think the panelists have identified quite closely about the lack of data in many of these patient population groups that make the HTA assessment quite difficult. And so we are talking to the regulator. We are talking to clinicians about what data is out there and how do we potentially work with the issues that are in front of us. We don't want to go against the regulator. We don't want to be seen as promoting funding beyond what the approved indications are, although we know that many of these products are used off-label. But it's a bit of a tough dynamic for us to provide recommendations that may be considered contradictory to what our regulator has authorized for the use in Canada. So that's one of our key challenges right there. I think Avi has mentioned a lot about the evidence, as well as Fleur, and particularly the gaps that we see when we're looking at our reviews. I do agree, as Wendy has said, we probably have to take a different perspective on how we do some of our economic modeling, particularly since we see with the more complex therapies coming in, larotrectinib is a great example. The issues go well beyond just the drug plans, who are our primary customers, and we need to factor in what the impacts are across the entire system. Our work uses a health system lens, and I do appreciate that results in us not factoring in more societal considerations in our analyses. However, I would also say, and I think Wendy alluded to this as well, the validity of the data that we have, and because we are open to including other impacts in our economic models, but what we tend to see is that the data is often quite weak, and it's difficult for our economics team to substantiate the impact of that information on the economic models. And so it's a bit of a push and pull type situation that we have to deal with. We realize it's not ideal, but we also need better data. And I was really intrigued by Fleur's presentation on the Hercules work, and where a patient group has gone to try to collect all of that information. And I thought that was quite incredible. The other part around the complexities, I think we rely on our clinical experts to provide guidance around these funding recommendations. They are often challenged by these new trials that are coming forward. How do you actually take that information and sort of shift the paradigm of how you look at this data from our usual perspective, which is tumor specific or disease specific, to something that's much broader than that? And how do you shift your mindset so that you're crafting recommendations that are fair? Particularly when you see a lot of discrepancies within that data that might be tumor specific. So it's a challenge for our expert committees to sort of adjust accordingly to the data that's in front of them. One area that we are exploring quite a bit is the use of real-world data, real-world evidence to help supplement the information that we have. We're not using this as a way to replace the trial data, but we know that there are a number of gaps, particularly with pediatric indications. And so again, that's what we've been talking to the regulator about, is if we were to use clinical data and supplement that with real world evidence to develop some of our funding mechanisms, would they have concerns with that? And rightly so. Their main issue is if that data is available, they would prefer that manufacturers submit that to them so that they can include that indication, as opposed to other groups kind of not working around them, but coming up with different approaches to how some of this information is digested. And ultimately, for everybody, it would be better to actually have it in the indication and having it submitted for review. But I realize that there may not be a funding investment. The return on investment is obviously not positive for a lot of pediatric indications, given the size of that population within Canada and other jurisdictions as well. So I think I'll stop at that and have to thank my panelists. As I said, they made my job very easy because they've highlighted a lot of concerns that we're struggling with as well.
Thanks so much for that, Brent. And after the audience have heard your reflections, I'm going to ask the audience a question to get them involved now. So we're going to run our first Slido, which is going to ask the question, you've heard a lot of issues being discussed here. Are there other issues you think we should be considering in relation to HTA of childhood diseases? And Bryce from HTAi will be opening that now. We'll continue our discussion for a bit, give people time to link into that. We as panelists won't type in. We'll see what the others have to say, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Brent, just one clarification there. You mentioned the particular issue about the case where there is a treatment for an adult condition and no data for children, bringing that back. I wonder if you have specific reflections on the treatments which we're now seeing coming through for a number of diseases that start in childhood or indeed are predominantly childhood, like Duchenne or some of the other neuromuscular disorders, and whether you think there are specific issues you're seeing with those.
So I think Fleur highlighted a couple of these within her presentation as well. One of the key issues that we tend to run into is understanding the natural history of these diseases. We are seeing some treatments coming forward for indications that we have very limited understanding of, some of the metabolic, inborn metabolic errors of metabolism. Sorry, I probably didn't say that properly. But there's obviously very limited experts in this area. And what we tend to do is work with our partner organization, INES, which is based in Quebec, to share expertise because we don't both want to be going after the same clinical experts and trying to be respectful of their time. But when we ask them, how is this data going to affect the later stages of the disease, a lot of that information isn't available. So our clinical experts, our expert committees are trying to look at all of this data, try to understand where the place in therapy is and what the overall impacts of these treatments are. And this is particularly an issue in the rare disease space. We've often had to talk with our committee members to say, look, we realize the data is not as robust as what you would see in a broader population of patients, but there may need to be a bit of a leap of faith that the initial information that's being seen does have ramifications later on in life. And so that just adds another dynamic to a lot of the discussion at the table, is to try to understand, and our clinical experts may not fully appreciate what all the implications are of a particular disease, because there are only a number of patients that could be only 1 or 2 patients in Canada, as an example. And so they just don't have enough information to be able to help answer some of those questions that many of our experts are asking as well.
And that's a really interesting issue there. Of course, I come from Scotland, as you can see from my background, and with only 5 million people, there are a number of diseases where we have no experts in Scotland, and we're lucky we can send them across the border to England. But it is a real challenge here. We talk about paucity of evidence, but the paucity of knowledge is key here as well, and the paucity of clinical expertise, patient expertise as well. Fleur, you mentioned there about, you mentioned kind of about the burden. One of the things that I'm kind of sometimes reflective of in the UK is that we may have UK patient groups, but actually there can be 3 HTA submissions going on at the same time. Do you see a way in which, for childhood diseases, where the input of particularly adolescents, but the carers as well is so important, that we could improve that for the way in which we engage with patient groups and with carers to kind of streamline the way we engage with patient groups?
Is that a question for me, Karen? Well, it's all about collaboration, I think, and actually we've touched on it already around the fact that the impact of the diseases may be similar in different diseases. So I think you really have to, in rare diseases, there's so few clinicians, patients, and you really have to try to categorize them, I think, to some extent. I think that would probably help. So rather than talking about rare diseases as a whole, as you mentioned, there's 6,000 of them. That's quite frightening, I would imagine, to a payer. Actually, of those 6,000, how many of them are really impacting on the patient and the family in a very significant way? And I think also potentially, and I would say this, but I think it's true, that the progressive diseases could be sort of pulled together, because the impact on a family like mine, for example, is probably very similar to the impact on a family with Batten or with SMA or any other sort of progressive disabling condition. In terms of the impact, the quality of life on the family, there's a whether it's like the chronic sorrow of living with this, or whether it's the practical nature of having to the parents having to give up their job, for example, as Wendy's mentioned, or the impact on the social services, they're probably very similar. So I do think that there is room to work with maybe the sort of umbrella organisations here, not just the specific patient organisations. So things like hospice groups, like Together for Short Lives, for example, who have an umbrella approach. That might be something that we could really look at. But I think collaboration is the key. Otherwise, you won't. The individual groups are just too small.
I think that's really interesting, Fleur, that the kind of need for collaboration comes through. And you picked up on something that Wendy said there. Wendy, you stressed the need for a family level approach. And that was kind of one of my recognitions, and it came through at the HTAi annual conference last year, that we need to go beyond thinking about patient and carers to families. Are there methodologies being developed to help us understand family impacts that could be considered in HTA?
This is a very exciting area of research for health economists right now, to understand how to model those family impacts. Several of my grad students, actually PhD and master students, are looking at these questions. You simply can't isolate the child as the only patient and completely disregard all of these other impacts, because not only are they substantial economically in terms of workforce implications, but they have health impacts on parents and caregivers that we really can't ignore. And I think in part they've been ignored in textbooks and guidelines, because those guidelines are very much emanating from welfare economics, which really focuses on the individual preferences, individuals as taxpayers, and individuals as responding to treatment. So there is some really, I think, cool methodological research about integrating both costs and qualities and utilities of multiple family members and looking at impacts in that way. Lots of publications are now coming through and some systematic reviews. And in the absence of guidelines, researchers have just really tried and gone on to do their own thing. So we are looking at that, and many researchers all over the world have been interested in this idea of spillover effects and how to study it better.
Oh, Karen, you're on mute.
Why is it me that had to do that? One of the comments we've had in is about is there a role for kind of novel drug medicine policy in relation to children? And Fleur, I wonder if you could describe a little bit about what happens in the UK. There's a special medicines policy, isn't there, for children? Can you share anything about that?
Yeah, so there's the Medicines for Children Act, but it really sort of applies more to the diseases we're talking about here, not so much the rare ones, but things like asthma, for example, where it is a disease that would affect anybody at any period in their life. You've managed to get your reimbursement through for an adult population, and then there is the capability to just have a discussion around enabling access to that medicine for children. So I've simplified that grossly, but that's sort of where it fits. And I think it's quite interesting that it doesn't seem to apply in these childhood diseases. So it seems to be very much for the those diseases which also impact on children, rather than ones that only impact on children. But there is some movement in that space, which is really helpful, because we don't often have the evidence for pediatrics, as I think it was Brent was mentioning earlier. We don't often have the evidence in those groups because the trials haven't been done.
Karen, I wonder if I could speak to that a little bit as well.
Yes,
I
please
think
do.
I think the issue of policy and kind of really broader level overarching and encompassing policy is really such an insightful question. And so there's such a lack. So to pick up on what Fleur was saying earlier, you know, she really, I think, stressed and hit home the need for collaboration. What I would add to that is the profound need for representation. There isn't much of a political voice around a lot of these issues for children. And Brent spoke to some of the breakdowns in linkages between levels of decision-making around pediatric drug policy and access to drugs for kids, from regulators through HTA bodies, through payers, and into the clinical spaces. So I think, frankly, and you know, even a webinar like this and HTAi contemplating a distinct working group, the fact that I can speak more to the Canadian context, that CADITH is really attending quite sensitively and thoughtfully to pediatrics now and how to innovate in that space, a recognition that pediatrics is distinct. All of those things are so profoundly important in not only identifying the issues, but in beginning to collaborate to surmount them. You know, in Canada now, to be specific about policies, regulators are beginning to consider pediatric specific provisions in the regulatory policy. And there's broader initiatives afoot to think about strategies for rare diseases broadly and pediatrics within that ambit. So I think it's such an important question. HTA is one piece of access. It's only one piece. And if we're not attending to all these pieces sort of in tandem and together, the problem won't get solved.
I think that's really insightful. And certainly in your slides, I remember you showing the regulatory initiatives, and actually in the EU, I think the pediatric investigation plan has been quite successful in encouraging research. And one of the things that has been mentioned, and I wonder, Wendy, if you've had any engagement with this, is the kind of potential for real world data in this space. You know, I think that Canada has some great registries. Is there potential work we could be doing here?
Yeah, so I mean, all of the limitations that Abby so nicely pointed out. I'm only familiar with Canadian studies, but there are registries and cohorts, I would say, to a limited extent, fill the vacuum of the lack of randomized controlled trials, which is still the gold standard way of measuring effectiveness. But Canada's small enough such that many specialist clinicians can band together in networks across the country. They know each other, and without too much pain, build networks that allow for ongoing observational longitudinal data collection. And there are many different patient conditions where this is happening, and making their data more and more available. And I don't know if Avi wants to speak to the example of POGO, the oncology network and pediatrics, but that's exactly what we need, that we can use. And the one thing I would also add is that I also have a role, another hat, where I'm actually sit on 2 different HTA decision-making committees, and they will access unpublished data. They will go directly to the registries, newborn registries and other registries, and have an open channel of keeping all the patient confidentiality and private health information respected. They will access data that's never been analyzed before, specifically for HTA purposes. So those types of things need to happen.
Great. Does anybody else want to kind of reflect on rare diseases, real world data?
I was going to. Oh, sorry. I was just going to add that the Critical Path Institute in the US was a really helpful source for us, helping us pull together diverse registries. I think one of the issues, and again, it's always issues, is around that registries don't necessarily collect the right things or the same things or at the same time. So trying to pull those together can be quite difficult. But working with groups like the Critical Path Institute is possibly the way forward. Sorry, Brent.
It's okay. I was just going to mention that there is a fair bit of work that we're trying to do within CADIF to look at what real world evidence is available, the data. I think what we tend to see is that there could be data that's being collected that people aren't aware of. And so our RWE lead is reaching out to those organizations to see what is available and how could it actually apply to some of the work that we are doing and making those linkages. So it is a very active space that we're involved with, and looking at how do you do things nationally in Canada to collect this information to support some of the uncertainty that we see within the data at this point.
And I think it was mentioned earlier about, Wendy, you mentioned about the development of PROs in certain childhood diseases and the generic EQ5DY. I'm wondering if there's a need for more novel outcomes when it comes to children. Is there a role for mobile apps or kind of AI? And I'm looking at Fleur here again, because I know that there's something going on in Duchenne. And I wonder, Fleur, if you want to tell us about that. And I can see Wendy smiling, so then I'll come back to Wendy as well, and then to Avi from a clinician's perspective.
I'll unpick some of that. So I think around the sort of quality of life measures that are across all diseases, I think they can be challenging in specific diseases, and particularly in childhood things. And it goes back to the growth piece that, so things like, can you do your usual activities? Those usual activities are changing, not just because you're growing up, but also because you're potentially becoming more disabled. So your usual activity may be, yes, I can still play on the Xbox, but actually that's not what your usual activity should be. It should be playing football. So a lot of those quality of life measures are quite tricky in those progressive diseases. In terms of the sort of more exciting novel endpoints, there is a company called Aparito who are looking at wearable devices and measuring sort of range of movement and what that range of movement might mean in terms of quality of life and capability of children. So there is quite a lot of work, and it's not just in Duchenne, it's in other areas as well, with the wearable devices and tracking activity and making it actually more interesting and fun for the child to answer the questions. Because having been in a clinical trial where we have been subject to multiple questionnaires, I could tell you that it would depend very much on the day, the time of day, the mood, what he'd had for lunch. Anything might have influenced that answer to those questions rather than what was actually happening to him physically.
That's really important insight there. So thank you, Fleur. Wendy, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, the qualities are very polarizing. I think love them or hate them. People have strong opinions about them, particularly in child health. It's hard to escape their universality and power of that when making funding recommendations. However, they do definitely fall short either measures don't exist or the quality of life constructs they contain don't reflect a child's reality. So I was just going to mention the capacity index, capability index, there's ICECAP. This is where we consider not just improvements to quality of life, but what that means for the child in a meaningful way, that they can go back to school, that they can learn, and that they can be thrive in a more, and so there's actually Dr. Al-Janabi, Harith Al-Janabi, and then there's the ICECAP group, I think in the UK, which are developing measures that specifically, these are psychometric measures, they can actually quantify capability in a way that's quite useful. The other thing I would just add is that, you know, at least with the HTA committees I am involved with when it comes to child health, to some degree we downplay the ICER results and we think about value in all of these other ways, preferences of patients, preferences of families, it's qualitative findings, engaging directly with families. And the funding recommenders who sit around this committee consider all this other evidence and put less weight really on an ICER that's fed by tools or data that's insufficient for the task. So I think de-emphasizing and putting more weight on other measures that are relevant for families is part of the HTA process.
I think that's really important. Avi, I wonder if you've got any kind of thoughts on this about where we should be emphasize how we should be undertaking the HTA from a kind of clinician's perspective. You see what's happening to the children, you're trying to undertake the best clinical research possible and deliver the best evidence. What should HTA be doing differently, do you think?
So I think Fleur's point earlier that the patients and families know more than the clinicians is important to bear in mind when I'm answering a question like this, really with humility. But Wendy took the words out of my mouth. So I love it when the health economist speaks to the value of qualitative findings. I do a lot of qualitative research, and I think that there is no supplanting rich deliberation in HTA committees to contextualize any of the quantitative findings that are put before committee members. I think, again, voice and representation are critical. And that's a tricky one because that needs to balance the fine line between testimonials and incorporating perspectives with advocacy. And that's not always easily done. You know, I think there's a need, Karen, to think more broadly and innovatively about what value means. And I tried to start with that. And that might mean thinking through ways to reconceptualize value for pediatric populations. And that doesn't mean to have totally separate streams of HTA frameworks or decision-making for kids, but it might mean modules or components of HTA frameworks that are child-tailored, that incorporate both patient and family and public values around what's important about childhood and child health, and to prime decision makers in HTA committees to those important considerations when deliberating.
That's great. Thanks, Avi. And I'm going to come back to you in a minute for a sort of reflection on whether after this discussion you think we need an HTAi interest group. But there's one thing we haven't discussed yet, and we had tried to get an ethicist onto the panel because you've talked about the need for a wide perspective. But when we talk about value, I indicated that some organizations do an ethical analysis. And Brent, I think in Cardiff, you do an ethical analysis for some projects. Would you do it for HTA related to childhood disease technologies?
I think it's possible. Where we tend to do our ethics analysis is more in the complex therapies. So for example, gene therapy, because there are a number of implementation components to that do require a bit of an ethical lens with respect to implementing. Recognizing that we're getting more and more complex issues coming to our expert committees, we have added an ethicist to both our oncology and non-oncology expert committees, recognizing that there will be more reliance on their inputs as we deal with some of these very challenging issues. I think we're still learning around what information is they can bring to the table and promote that discussion as we are deliberating on a particular drug funding request. So that I can see becoming more and more important as we introduce these topics to our expert committees, and definitely see a lot of value with having an ethicist in our deliberations.
And Karen, maybe I can add, these are all and always inherently ethical decisions, right? This is not as though some technologies have some ethical dimensions and other ones don't. These are sort of riven through with ethical issues from the get-go. Qualities are an ethical measure. All of these are about resource allocation in health systems. And so I think the value of trained and thoughtful ethical thinking around any of these technologies, and it's especially pitched in pediatrics and in rare or complex diseases or technologies, is really valuable.
And certainly within HTAi, I've heightened my interest in ethical input through the HTAi Ethics Group, which has a number of great members from Canada, but particularly from Scandinavia, very strong ethical input in those countries. And why I'm intrigued by this is in my own research, as I said, there was very little explicitly stated about differences in the decision making in relation to diseases that affect children, particularly rare life-limiting diseases. But in individual interviews with people, they would say quite clearly, that some diseases actually touch them emotionally. These are challenging to have to assess and to make a decision on when there is a paucity of data, but that also inherently they had an inborn flexibility to their decision making, which wasn't explicit. And it's actually quite interesting. There are a number of ethical dimensions around that, and whether we could tease those out would be interesting. I think we've had a great discussion, and we know that people have been watching in. And Avi, I wonder if you have any final reflections for me as should I, kind of begin to put together a proposal for HTAi for an interest group in this field? Do you think it's worthwhile? And what might it focus on? What are your thoughts?
So again, this is going to be that fine line between honest testimony and advocacy. I have a clear bias here. I think, the panelists on this have really eloquently demonstrated that there are really unique issues that need to be dedicatedly attended to in pediatrics that transit across ethics and across real world evidence, but have some distinguishing characteristics and need for specific focus. If I can try to sum up what was a really rich discussion, I would say I've heard sort of three main things that are particularly compelling about pediatric HTA that need a distinct interest group. And they are, I think we heard really strongly for the need for new approaches, both to pediatric HTA in terms of how it adjudicates value, and maybe even more specifically, how to generate the evidence, both clinical and economic and patient level, for how to support those value determinations. I think Fleur really sold us on the critical need for collaboration in these spaces where the diseases are rare, the social values are pitched, and that means collaboration across countries, across disciplines, and across stakeholder groups. And what I think was so magnificent about Fleur's discussion of the Hercules project is it managed to build those bridges across all the stakeholder groups involved, and that's really rare. And then I think the last thing is a need for an explicit ideational focus on kids, and the corollary political voice that comes with that. Without that specific focus, some of this will happen in the margins in the rare space and in the RWE space, but it won't happen for children in a concerted way. So that's my plug for the HTAi Child Health Technologies Assessment Interest Group. We very much would welcome interest and members, and I think open to discussions about what might be foci for that interest group.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great way to stop. And I'm going to ask Bryce if on the Slido he can put my email address in, k.facey@btinternet.com. If your enthusiasm has been sparked by today's conversation and you'd like to join in this interest group, do contact us now, because we'll be putting in a proposal to HTAi. So be with us from the scoping phase and help us direct the way in which we move this collaboration. So I'd like to thank all my presenters and discussant, Brent, for being here. Thank you everyone so much for your input.